Hello, welcome to Back to Basics, Creating a Marketing Plan for the Wisconsin Valley Library Service. I'm Cordelia Anderson, and I will be leading this webinar today. Just before we jump into the content, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about myself. So I am a library marketing and communications consultant, and I've been doing this work for about 6 years. But before that, I worked in public libraries for 15 years, and I've also served on the board of an academic library for about 6 years as well. So I have a lot of direct library experience, probably similar to what some of you have experienced, or maybe a little bit different. All libraries share certain commonalities and are unique in their own ways. I'm also accredited in public relations, which is a type of credential that really ensures that you understand the strategies of public relations and marketing. So I try to bring that into all of my training. I also have a book from ALA Editions called Library Marketing and Communications, Strategies to Increase Relevance and Results. And so a lot of the content you're going to hear today is echoed in that book, but in that book, I have different examples and chapters on different topics. So, your library may have a copy of this already. Feel free to dive into that if you have additional questions, and you can always contact me, and my contact information is at the end of this presentation. So let's jump right in. So what are we going to talk about in this webinar? We're going to talk about how to create a marketing and communications plan for your library. And first, we're going to talk about the planning process known as RPIE, which I did learn when I got my accreditation in public relations, but I find it is used in a variety of disciplines as well as industries. We're going to talk about identifying your unique audiences for your library. And importantly, we're going to talk about creating goals, key messages, and strategies that are going to keep you focused on your end result that you're trying to achieve with your marketing and communications plan. Then we're going to talk about how you can use this framework to create plans either for special projects, events, and initiatives, or for your whole library. So let's start with RPIE. RPIE stands for, as you can see, Research, Planning, Implementation, and Evaluation. And while I first learned this as a linear process, I actually think of it more as a cyclical process, because really the evaluation, which is where you look at the things you did and you see what worked and what didn't, that really provides research for the next phase of your plan. So let's say you have an annual marketing and communications plan for your library and you have certain goals. Well, at the end of that year, as you evaluate how you did, that's going to serve as research for the next year. So you can continue to work smarter, not harder, a favorite motto of mine. And you can also hopefully reach more audiences with more successful strategies because you learned a lot in that previous year. Similarly, if you're creating a marketing plan for a specific event, let's say that event comes around every year. If you do your evaluation at the end of that event to see how things worked, again, you're going to take that knowledge and you're going to roll it into the next year's event. So let's go first to research and talk about some of the different kinds of research that you can do. One important aspect of research that I mentioned when I talked about the overview of this webinar is learning about your audiences. So every library has a set group of audiences, whether you're an academic library, a public library, or a special library. You know who your customers and potential customers are. So it's important not only to know who they are, but to know what they want and need, because that's a critical component of marketing, is making sure that you have the services, the programs, the collections that they want. And then finally, how do you best reach them? So knowing your audience means knowing where they get their information and how you can get information about your library in front of them. Another form of research, which you could also kind of consider planning, is developing key messages. But the reason I put it in research is because in many cases, your library already has some really good key messages. They're just maybe not gathered in one convenient place. So for example, most libraries, when I go to their websites, I go to their About Us page. And about 90% of libraries have some kind of About Us page. Not all, I wish all, but not all. And so that's usually where a lot of your foundational key messages live, like when your library was established, how it's governed, maybe how many locations you have, things like that. that are really foundational messages that don't change very much. So there is a research component to just gathering your existing key messages. And guess what? That's work that you don't have to do. You don't have to write those key messages because they probably already exist. They also could be places like brochures, and we'll talk about that more later. But also, you may want to find or develop messaging about what makes your library the right organization to meet your audience's needs. And that's really special because a lot of times I think libraries, we feel like we want to be somewhat generic and serve everyone with everything, because we kind of do, right? But there are specifics about why libraries are the best organization to deliver some of these things. And it's important to tell your audiences that those facts, right? And then finally, of course, how people can access your programs and services. Again, you may already have a lot of that. I remember doing a marketing and communications plan for a client of mine where I basically just poured through their services page on their website, and I was able to pull out a lot of information about how to access their programs and services. All they really needed me to do was add some, taglines at the beginning of that to kind of get people interested in accessing those resources. And then finally, assessing your existing communication. So looking at all the things you're currently doing to communicate about or market your library, and just looking at them and saying, what is good about this? What do I want to keep? And what things do I want to improve upon or build upon? So that's some basic research that you can do, and it shouldn't be too labor intensive, right? So we'll go through some of that a little bit more later, especially the audiences piece. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is create a plan that sort of looks like this. You're going to have a big picture goal, right? Whether it's an event and your big picture goal is for X number of people to attend that event, or it's a fundraising thing, so you want to raise X number of dollars or get this many donors, or if it's a new service you're launching and you want X number of people to use that service within a certain set period of time. So that's going to be your goal, and your measurable objectives are going to be the measurement piece. So if it is ticket sales or dollars raised or people using a certain service or growing circulation by a certain percentage, whatever that might be, that's your measurable objective. Now, the strategies and tactics are going to be the things you already are doing, like social media posts, email marketing, website banners, flyers, all that kind of stuff, right? But ultimately, what you're trying to accomplish is what's over here on the right, which is that you are taking your messaging, whether it's existing messaging or new messaging that you've developed, and you're pushing it out through various channels to ultimately reach your audiences, because what you want them to do is take an action. You want them to interact with your library, again, whether it's getting a library card, checking out a book, coming to an event, or whatever that might be. So this is really what we're all trying to accomplish, kind of as a broad overview. So let's talk a little bit about the next stage in RPIE, which is implementation. Implementation is where you then create those messages, or again, repurpose the messaging that you found in your research phase. But you want to take that messaging and really center your audiences in it. We have a tendency in libraries and other organizations, I've worked with nonprofits, government agencies, we all kind of do this. We tend to center the organization because we're usually an organization that's doing good. So we're like, hey, the library's doing this, the library's doing that. Aren't we great, right? And actually, libraries tend to be very humble. So there often aren't a lot of messaging around, aren't we great? In fact, I think libraries should probably do more of that. But really, we're centering the library and what it's doing. But what we really want to do is center the needs of your audiences and describe how your library is meeting those needs. So it's really just a reframing of the message. You're still telling them what it is the library has to offer, but you're just framing it around how you're meeting their needs. And there's really 4 types of messaging I've identified in libraries. The first is your foundational messaging, which I mentioned earlier. That's the stuff that's going to be on your About Us page, or if you have like a brochure you hand out when people get a library card, or an annual report. Those are the things that are known about your library that stay the same for the most part. Then we have what I call service messages, and these are really the messages about all the different things that you offer, and libraries offer so much. We have digital collections, print collections, but also spaces, meeting rooms, maker spaces, online resources. There's so many lesser known library services that I always want to make sure to elevate those as well, because we do tend to skewed towards certain services and programs that we tend to promote all the time. And that's what brings me to what I call seasonal messages, which is really your programming content. And the reason I put that in the seasonal bucket is because programs have a set date and time usually, unless it's like an on-demand thing. So they change seasonally. You know, every month you have a new slate of programs for your various audiences. And so we tend to spend the most of our time in library marketing on seasonal messages. And what I encourage libraries to do is to balance that out with these other forms of messaging, especially those service messages, because while you may be promoting a program that meets a specific need, you probably also have collections that meet that need, or resources that meet that need, or even physical spaces. So I don't want libraries to shy away from marketing these other things. Programs, because they are constantly churning and changing, they kind of are the squeaky wheel, and they're important, but all these other things are important too. So that's why I divide it into the 4 different types. And then finally, we have impact messaging, which I used to kind of refer to when I was managing a library marketing department as the after the fact messaging. So it's like, after the program, how have you made someone's life better? Or after they use the library as maybe a specific resource or collection, how did they have their need met? Whether it's someone coming in and doing genealogy research and they found a long lost ancestor, or it's simply someone who came to a program with their child and found that their child discovered the joy of reading and suddenly wanted to read a lot. All of those impact messages tend to come after the fact. And when we are in that churn that I mentioned with new programs and new services coming online and always looking to the future, we sometimes either forget or feel like we don't have the time to pause and look back. But I think it's really important to do that both when you're evaluating things as well as to find those stories of impact, because that really will speak to your audiences, not only about how their needs are being met, but how the needs of their community, how the needs of their neighbors are being met. And that causes them to see libraries in a different light, see them as more relevant, see them as worthy investments of public or tuition dollars, whatever that might be. So it's really important, if you want to change people's attitudes and beliefs about libraries, to serve up all these different types of messaging so they can begin to see the full picture of the library, not just programs and services. Another thing I would encourage you to do is, if you look at many libraries' social media feeds, especially their Instagram and Facebook, you're going to see a lot of program posts. And what you really want to see, again, is that balance. And you want to see storytelling that includes not only what programs and services are coming up, but how the library is meeting the needs of its audiences. And so as you have these different types of messages, you're going to get these messages out to your audiences using different channels, which I will introduce you to something called the PESO method. I didn't invent it, but I think it's a handy way of sorting out all the different channels. As you know, we keep adding more and more new ways to reach audiences, and rarely are we getting more and more staff or budget. So it's really challenging. So I find organizing it to be very helpful. And then, of course, you want to align those strategies and tactics with your goals and objectives. So if you're trying to accomplish a specific thing, how can you make sure all your effort is going toward that thing? So I mentioned changing people's attitudes and beliefs, which is really why I love this pyramid, which I adapted from the book Effective Public Relations, which is really about the different ways that you can measure success. So as I talked about earlier, evaluating your marketing and communications plan is an important component. And again, it serves as research, right? And so there's all different kinds of ways that you can evaluate your marketing and communications plan. And I am not advocating you need all of these. I think you could just have a full-time job measuring things if you tried to measure all of these things. But as you can see, there's different levels of measurements. And again, they're all very valid. So you have your preparation metrics, which tell you, did you prepare well? Did you have a good plan? Did you write good messaging? Did you design a appealing, graphic to go with it? All of those sorts of things. Did you do your research, right? Those are things that are important. The next level up is implementation metrics. So a lot of people will say like, oh, we sent an email newsletter and it was read by 10,000 people, right? That's a implementation measure, because you see how many people are receiving your messages and actually reading them and maybe even acting on them. So you might say, well, 10,000 people read it, and of those 10,800 people clicked on the link to get tickets or whatever. So again, that is implementation metrics, very important, very valuable. This will feed into our measurable objectives. When you think about things that you can measure and that you want to measure, it's going to be something probably on this pyramid. And then finally, you have your impact measures. And so that's where we get into things like, not only did somebody try this service, but they continued using it. Maybe they told their friends and family about it, right? They became loyal users. Maybe they became advocates for the library. We also want to see people changing their attitudes, because overwhelmingly the public sentiment about libraries is still a little outdated. People tend to think, oh, well, libraries is great for books and children, but I don't really need the library. When in fact, you probably have a dozen or more services that person might benefit from. So we're really trying to change people's attitudes and opinions about libraries while also trying to get them to do the thing we want them to do, right? It's a dual purpose and a win-win situation if we can accomplish that. So these are the different types of metrics, and I'll give you some examples on how you can incorporate those into your measurable objectives a little bit later. But it's really about knowing what you can measure, knowing how you can measure some of these things, and then kind of creating a reporting cadence. So it's not about necessarily measuring things once, right? If you have a big library initiative coming up in 8 months and you're making a plan for it now, you don't want to wait and measure its success at the end, because then it's too late to do anything about it. So what I recommend is looking at your measures probably about once a month. Or if your initiative or event or service is sooner than that, maybe even once a week, and really looking at, okay, how are we doing? How are we progressing toward our goal? Have enough people seen the message? Have enough people clicked on the link? If this many people click on the link every week, will it all add up to success for us? Or whatever that measure may be, you want to look at it before the thing happens, and then look at it after. And so that's where we get into things called leading and lagging indicators, which I'll talk about a little bit more later too. Leading indicators are the things that you look at ahead to see how you're progressing. And then lagging indicators are things that you look at after the fact to see if you were successful. So let's talk about how you can get started. Again, I always recommend starting with audiences because it's their wants and needs that you're trying to fill, right? So the two primary functions that I'm talking about here when I say a marketing and communications plan are public relations and marketing. Now, a lot of times these words get used interchangeably, or they are used as synonyms for promotion, but they're actually higher level functions than that. So public relations is really about establishing and maintaining mutually beneficial relationships between your library and your audiences. And that's really important, because if people feel like they have a relationship with the library, they're going to be more invested. They're going to be more likely to try new services and programs. And again, to advocate or tell their friends and family about the library. Marketing, on the other hand, is really identifying the needs and wants, as I mentioned earlier, but also offering the products and services to satisfy those demands and delivering those products and services to your customers. So it's not just enough to subscribe to certain databases or buy certain collections. What you want to do is make sure you're offering the things that people actually want and need, and making sure it's easy for them to access. That delivering the products and services to customers is also important. Is your website easy to use? Is it easy for people to understand how to log in to access the ebooks or get a ticket for that event, or donate to the library? So there's kind of multiple phases in marketing, right? It's the beginning of knowing what they want and need and making sure you're catering to that, all the way to the end where you're making sure it's easy for them to do the thing that you want them to do. And you would think that that would be a no-brainer, but in libraries, I find we often have these sort of barriers and structures in place that actually make it hard for people to do the thing that we're asking them to do, which seems a little counterintuitive, right? So we want to work on that as well. So let's talk a little bit about this relationship, as I mentioned, in public relations. So there's kind of two, again, I mentioned the word promotion. I like to kind of frame it as moving from promotion to engagement in libraries. So promotion, you're still doing a lot of work, you're pushing out your messaging through all these different channels. Maybe you're doing a press release. Maybe you're putting it on social media. You're sending out an email. I just realized I still have the Twitter logo on here, and you know what? I'm going to keep it. I miss the old Twitter. So you're doing all these things, but it kind of feels like the old adage of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, right? And so you don't necessarily know your time is being well spent, or you're going to get the results that you want. So what I encourage libraries to do is move toward engagement. And if you follow RPIE, you're going to get there, because really engagement is about you, the library, and this is an old communications model, the sender-receiver model. You, the library, are communicating with your audiences. That's the receiver. But another important component of the relationship is hearing back from those audiences through what I call feedback. But feedback can be anything from, do they use the service? So what are the trends? What are the circulation trends, the program attendance trends? That's feedback, because that's telling you, oh yes, what you're offering is valuable to me, and I am using it. I'm voting with my feet, so to speak. But feedback could also be things like surveys, or what you hear across the desk from your customers. It could be, the contact us form on your website and people are emailing. There's all different ways that your audiences give you feedback, and it's really important to attend to and listen to that feedback so that you can continue to customize that message to them, to their needs. And again, that creates a virtuous cycle, a positive relationship, and a positive association with the library, which again makes all the rest of your work much easier. So you're still doing the things on the left, but those really only represent the message part. You've got to also add in that feedback. And another form of feedback I forgot to mention is on social media. Are you actively listening to what people are saying on social media? Because they will tell you a lot there too. All right, I'm gonna have a little sip of water here. Now let's talk about audiences. So if you've listened to this webinar so far, you probably know I like having categories to help organize things. I alluded to PESO, which I'm going to talk about later. But for libraries, after working in libraries for many years, I started to think of our audiences in these three categories. And these three categories are really about who they are and what is important to them. So you have your internal audiences. That's the no-brainer, right? That's your staff. But it also could include groups like your board, your volunteers. If you have third-party vendors like security firm or maintenance folks, and anybody else who might work in your library or need to know the same things that an employee might need to know or a board member might need to know. Obviously, it's going to be a little different for the different subsets of audiences. So if you have a larger library system, for example, you may have like directors, managers, staff, frontline staff, different support departments, and so on. And again, so there's some fine tuning between what each group needs to know, but the main thing of knowing your audience is making sure you don't forget anybody when there's something important that is going to happen. And also making sure that your messaging is addressing the questions that they might have. So for staff, a lot of times what they want to know is, what do I need to know to do my job effectively, right? So that's your internal audiences. Next, let's talk a little bit about external audiences. Those are the ones that we're generally promoting our services and programs to, right? So that's your current library customers, but also maybe people who used to use the library but have lapsed. It could be people who've never used the library, but we're hopefully going to get them to. As well as your broader community residents or your campus residents. If you're an academic library, it's your community partners, it's other community serving organizations and nonprofits and groups like government agencies. And then it's also your news media, because they are not only a channel, because they are a channel for reaching these external audiences, but they are also an audience in and of themselves, because guess what? They also have needs and wants, right? And I once had a reporter say to me, reporters want to be the hero. They don't want you to come to them with a problem and a solution. They want you to come to them with a problem that they get to solve. So, if for example, literacy is a problem in your community, they want to be the one who gets to say, well, I discovered that the library is doing this, this, and this. So, part of that is positioning them as sort of the solution finder, right? So that's your external audiences. And then finally, we have funding stakeholders. These sometimes get overlooked, but they are also very important. And the messaging that they are most interested in is, how is the library a good investment, right? Whether it's an investment of our time, of our advocacy, and of our dollars. So most libraries, you've got public funders, and that could be at the local, state, or national level, or a mix. It's usually a mix in public libraries. Then you have maybe you work with a municipality and they have a budget office that decides what the budget allocations are for your library and other agencies. You may have elected officials who go over and approve your library's budget or the larger budget of which your library is a part. You may have friends of the library or a foundation. You may have private donors at the individual, corporate, or foundation level. And you may also receive grants. All of these are funding stakeholders. And while they all, again, have their own different characteristics, the one thing they're all going to want to know is that their money, their the old saying of like time and talent and money, right? They want to make sure those things are being used wisely. So because they have a multitude of other organizations that they could give that funding to, but we want them to know that the library is the right investment. I used to always say in my community that with the library, our local county, they had a huge budget and a lot of that would go to the school system, rightly so. The school system was also funded by the state, but the county would put in a lot of funding for extra stuff. Well, I used to say, the library, you get a lot of bang for your buck. They could give us, a tiny fraction of what the school system would get in terms of increases, and they would get a huge amount of positive impact from that. So it was a way to kind of tell them, hey, we want you to invest in schools, but also if you give us this small incremental increase, you'll see us partner with the schools to help those students do even better. And you'll see us do these other initiatives that are going to help with educational outcomes in our community. So again, it's just thinking about what's important to those audiences and making sure you're delivering on that. So if you start with your audiences, again, that's going to move you more from promotion to engagement because you're beginning to think about them and the feedback you're hearing from them. And again, that will create that more meaningful relationship, which is what these cute little hearts are representing. So if you're going to go through and identify your unique audiences for your library, I recommend you can start with the sample ones I created. But then you could also have an internal meeting and make it kind of a fun activity if you want to get other people involved in the marketing of your library, where you can have I say a 90-minute meeting. It could honestly be an hour-long meeting if you wanted to, but really just go through and have people brainstorm as many different audiences as they can think of in those 3 categories. And then you can review their input, kind of combine things that might be duplicative, but you may find that you're identifying new and different audiences that you hadn't thought of. And I often do this with my clients where I'll do some initial research on my own. Again, I'll look at their website, I'll look at their census data, I'll find out, the outlines of who their audiences are. But then I'll meet with them and they will tell me a lot of information that you can't just get from those statistics, like who they see in their branches, who are the underserved community, underserved people in their communities, and so on. So it's a really valuable exercise if you can make the time. Another thing, as I talked about earlier in the RPIE discussion and showing you that overview of what a marketing and communications plan really is, the main thing that's going to orient everything you do after you've learned about your audiences, because ultimately they are your end user, is to create a goal, a big picture goal. Of what you want to achieve. And what I really like to do with goals is a little bit different than you might see in other things. I like to use the measurable objectives as the thing where we put in the numbers of, we want to sell this many tickets or increase usage by this percentage, and have the goal be this more idealistic sort of pie in the sky thing, really describing what is the ideal future state that you want to create as a result of your successful marketing and communications plan. And I always also recommend, if your library has a strategic plan, a strategic framework, or maybe you're part of a larger organization that has one, like if you're an academic library, maybe your university or college has a strategic plan or strategic goals, or if you're a public library, maybe you're part of a county or a city, or you have your own. You want to make sure your marketing and communications goal ties into that and aligns with that, because again, that's just another way that you can work smarter, not harder, because you're working toward the same thing that everyone else is working toward. So when you want to set a goal for your library, I encourage you to kind of ask yourself some of these goal setting questions. And the big one is, in the future, because again, we're talking about marketing and communications here, right? So in the future, how do you want people to see your library? What is your big, hairy, audacious goal? Like what would you most like to see? If your library achieved everything it set out to achieve in its strategic plan or maybe in your mission and vision, how would you describe people's attitudes toward the library? And if you could communicate everything you want to everyone you want, even those hard to reach audiences and those people who never use the library, and as a result, they do or think or believe what you wish they would think, what would that situation look like? So again, you're describing your ideal outcome. So here's an example of a goal that's I adapted from one I created for UNC Charlotte's library a few years back, which is that their libraries would be the center of intellectual life at the university, advancing the scholarly and creative endeavors of the university and the greater community by providing exceptional collections, spaces, services, and technologies. So that kind of sounds like a goal, doesn't it? Now, they certainly had measurable objectives that would tell them if they were progressing toward that goal, but that was their pie in the sky, ideal situation. Here's a public library example. And again, this is adapted from what I did for a client. This library here is just a stock image. It wasn't this library. But that these public libraries would be recognized as the county's leading provider of information, entertainment, and exploration, inspiring people to pursue lifelong learning and create a thriving community, right? That's a lovely goal to have. So once you have your goal, and that's very fun and pie in the sky and happy, now we got to get down to brass tacks. Now we've got to know whether we're going to be successful. And this is important both for research and, you guessed it, evaluation, because if you write a good measurable objective, then you will have already done your research, and this objective will tell you whether you achieved success through your measurement. So again, as you're creating your measurable objectives, you want to incorporate your audiences. You want to make sure that they are measurable again. So we'll talk about like what things a library has at their disposal to measure, and then include a time frame. So again, if your event is in 8 months, that's your time frame. If you're doing an annual plan for your library, that's your time frame. And again, these measures are part of planning and evaluation. So the template for a measurable objective that I was taught, again, when I got my accreditation, was that you're going to do a thing by a certain amount, that's your measurement, by a certain time frame, and then you're going to say as measured by and be very specific about. So you're not only saying like we want to do it by this much, but we're going to say we're going to measure it using this. So I'll give you some more concrete examples because I find that makes it a little easier to understand. So one example would be to increase usage of library locations, services, programs, and collections by 10%. So that's by how much? By the end of the year, as measured by increases in door count, circulation, and program attendance. So these are 3 common statistics that libraries have. Sometimes door count is called visits. We used to call it door count. I don't know why. And so this would be a good example of a measurable objective. Now, you remember that handy pyramid I showed you earlier? Well, here's your cheat sheet to know where on the pyramid this objective falls. So this is actually an impact measure because if you remember at the top of the pyramid, it said the number of people who behave as desired and or hopefully repeat that behavior. Here's another example of a measurable objective, which is to increase awareness. So if you remember, the last one was to increase usage. This one is about increasing awareness, which is, attitudes, beliefs, and opinions hopefully come after awareness. So we want to increase awareness of library locations, services, programs, and collections. So kind of the same 4 things I mentioned earlier. By the end of the year, as measured by increases in social media engagement and email marketing open rates. So now we're going a little further down the pyramid to those middle measures, which are your implementation measures. And again, still very important. And these can be leading indicators that will tell you, again, whether your efforts are successful during your campaign. Anyone want to guess where this falls on the pyramid? Well, I'll just tell you. again, I already kind of did tell you this is an implementation measure. So the number of messages received and the number of people, again, who acted on those messages, because we looked at email marketing open, and I should have actually put click rates in here too, right? Because opening an email is sort of an action, although I kind of think of it more as a sort of awareness. They've read it, but they haven't necessarily done anything. If they click through on that email, that's really a action, which is very good because that's what you want them to do. So here's a little more on key messages, as I mentioned those a little bit earlier. So these are really the language you use to describe your library to your audiences, and they describe, again, how your library is meeting the needs of your customer and the community. And there are several types. Another thing I like to say, and I don't have it on the slide, but is that you have messaging and then you have content. Content is literally the stuff that you write, right? It's the short social media posts with a cool picture, or it's the press release, or it's whatever. The messaging is what goes into your content, right? But you may have like foundational messages that are a page long. You're not going to necessarily put all of that into a social media post. You may just pull from that. So if you think of it as your key messages are sort of like the source material, and then the content is how you deliver that to your audiences. And sometimes they may be the same, it just depends on the format and the need. So again, I mentioned you have those foundational messages that change rarely. You can probably find them by looking on your website or in brochures and things like that, but you may also identify some gaps and want to update or revise those. You have your service messages, which I mentioned are, all the things that you offer. These tend to change episodically. So I used to remember at my library, we kind of got savvy and learned when our collection development department would renew the big databases that we offered, because sometimes they would come to us and be like, oh, we're getting rid of this database, but we're adding this database, or we're switching from Mango languages to this other language platform because we got a good deal, or whatever that might be. Instead of being caught by surprise by those things, we started to kind of anticipate them, because we knew these things do change episodically, right? You may add a makerspace, you may take away something. So those are your service messages. Your seasonal messages, as I mentioned earlier, those things change constantly because there's that churn of new programs coming up, new things coming up. And then your impact messages, as I mentioned, which is sort of the pause and look back messaging, right? How your program and service, how all those things you promoted actually made a difference for your customers or for your community. And impact messages they don't just have to be about one person. It could be a larger community outcome, or it could be one person. There's any way that you're telling the story of your library's impact, either on individuals or on communities or even on partners and their audiences. It's all valuable stuff. So first, again, as I mentioned earlier, go ahead and capture your existing key messages. Don't make work for yourself, right? These things have already been written, they've been vetted and approved. So why not go ahead and pull some of that content together? And now you've got already the beginnings of a key messages document. I also recommend familiarizing yourself, if you haven't already, with your library statistics. That was a valuable tool when I was a marketing director at my library, to be able to say, at the end of the year, circulation increased by 20% over last year, not only just for your measurable objectives, but also for messaging, like being able to tell a reporter, hey, you know what? We had, 1,000 more people attend story time this year than last year. That's a sign that more people are using the library, So statistics can have a lot of uses in marketing, not just in measuring your success, but also telling your story. And statistics can also be paired with impact stories, by the way. So maybe you have a story about one little child who came to story time and then went home and decided to do story time for his brothers and sisters, right? That could be a really heartwarming impact story. And then if you tie that to the statistic that we had 1,000 more people come to story time this year, that just gives people a sense of, oh my gosh, look at all the good the library is doing in the community. Maybe that's 1,000 little kids going back and doing story time for their family. It's just like, it amplifies that good feeling. Mission, vision, values, of course, should be part of your foundational messaging. And again, service messaging, program and event contents, all good stuff. So begin organizing that, I recommend, whether it's just in a Google Doc or a Word doc, just to have it handy. This also can help you if you ever have any kind of a crisis where you need to continually repeat the same information over and over and make sure you're being consistent and accurate. Here's one way that I suggest to approach getting a handle on your seasonal messages and your programming, because as I mentioned earlier, and as many of you may have experienced, promotion of programs and services tends to take up most of our time in library marketing. And I've done some informal polls like on social media among library marketers, and on average, they say about 75% of their time is spent just on programs and services. And when you think about that in the context of all the other things that the library does, again, that's out of balance. So one way that you can try to get a handle on that would be to build a content calendar, because there are certain things that you know come around every single year, right? But also a content calendar can kind of give you that discipline of looking at other things outside of programming that also come around every year. So kind of integrating your service messaging with your seasonal messaging. So I recommend your content calendar not only have, what your and I kind of captured programming at a few different places, services and programs to highlight. So that could be a service or a program. Seasonal happenings could be things that are, again, happening because of what time of year it is, but they could also be programs like this fall festival, or they could be, women's history programs, whatever that might be. And then community happenings too, because you want to always have that outside lens on not only what's happening in your library, but what's happening in your broader community or campus that you could potentially tie in with or be a part of or be a partner on. Internal priorities, the marketing team, even though our job is supposed to be to get customers in the door, we often get called upon to do internal communications, which is appropriate. But so there may be internal things happening, as well as I like to have an other category for things like, oh yeah, we're redesigning our website. That's a big impact, right? And sometimes those kind of things catch you off guard because you're so busy on that kind of hamster wheel of promoting programs. And suddenly someone's like, oh yeah, we're going to change our website next month. And you're like, what? So a content calendar helps you plan ahead and also encourages you to ask questions of your colleagues about what do you have coming up this year that I need to have on my radar. I'm going to put it on my content calendar. It gives you a nice excuse. And I found when I started doing this, actually other departments used it because it helped them have an idea of what was going on at the organization, because we tend to kind of just focus on our area. But I feel like marketing and communications people are looking at everything. And so we have a unique lens into everything happening at a library. So we can actually be a help to our internal colleagues and helping them have a big picture lens as well. And that's where finding collaborators comes in. So as I mentioned before, we got savvy about communicating with our collection development department to know when the different resources would come up for renewal, or if they were adding a new collection or expanding a certain resource. That was really helpful to know. We could also have conversations with them, like with certain digital platforms we had about usage and growing usage, or trying to maintain usage because maybe the budget, we'd hit a budget cap on a certain ebook platform or something. So really good to know what's going on with them. Programming staff, really good to know what's going on with them and have a good collaborative relationship. I find sometimes in libraries there can be a little friction between programming staff and marketing staff if they're not in the same department, because again, there's always going to be a need for more marketing of programs, but the marketing folks or communications folks sometimes have to push back and be like, well, actually, there's other things we also need to communicate about. And that can cause some friction, which again is why having something like a content calendar can give people a better perspective, and giving them input into the content calendar is also really important. So I've actually developed like process maps for clients where there's a new request that comes in, and one of the checkpoints in that workflow is, should I add this to the content calendar? Because now it's going to be maybe come around every year, or it's 6 months away. So I want to make sure it's on the content calendar. So many collaboration opportunities here. Also being in touch with your branch managers. They can tell you they have special events or renovations or other things coming up, or if they're hearing certain things from their customers that is valuable marketing intel. And then, of course, your web developers and IT. Again, you want to know, are they doing an ILS migration next year? That's a huge impact that you've got to work around. Are they, shutting down all the computers for a week at this branch because they're upgrading them? Something you definitely need to know. So again, just communicating with these folks and collaborating with them so they understand you're there to help them, but you also need them to work with you to plan ahead because they're finite resources to market and communicate about your library. So I mentioned earlier about content versus messaging. So what we have here on the right really is sort of the messaging that I invented a fake event. Don't go to this URL. I don't know where it goes. But I invented a fake event called the Books and Arts Festival. And so I have like some content here that is an example of effective long form messaging that can then be used for creating content for different places. So on the right, we have the messaging, and you can see I've written it to center the audience. So instead of being like the library is having this event, it's, are you interested in these things? And if you are, we've got this thing that's going to meet your need, right? And then we've got all that other really important information like the who, what, when, where, why. And the why is also very important. So if you see down here, not only are we thanking a donor, but we're also saying the donor has given us this money because they recognize the library's role as a local gathering place for the community and local creators. There's your messaging right there. The library is a community hub. It's thriving. It's vibrant. Everybody sees the value in it. You know, these are the things you want to convey in your messaging, right? This is important stuff. And then finally, the all-important call to action. Okay, get your tickets, go to this website. You'd be surprised how many times in library land people forget to add a call to action. And so a lot of times it's like, okay, well, what do you want people to do when they read this message? Not just know they are having this program, but what do they need to do? How do they get there? Where do they park? Like, how are we delivering these services and programs in a way that is convenient and accessible for our audiences? You got to think through all these things, right? It goes back to that mutually beneficial relationship. So over here on the left now, here's an example of just a short social media post. And this is of a link that would fit on X, for example. So we've got, again, condensed version. We've got a URL, call to action. We've got a what's in it for me, like, oh, if you have a library card, you get a discount. Again, this is a made up event. You can do it your own way. But this is what I would call your short form content. And with what I like to describe as a hub and spoke model, what I recommend is having your longer form content or messaging somewhere on your website, like maybe a blog or maybe, again, a press release posted on your website, that your short form content can point back to if people want to learn more, because you can't fit everything in the social media post. So this is, again, content, messaging, short form, long form. And the other thing I would just say when you're creating that short form content, don't put this text in a Canva graphic and put it on your Instagram, please. Put this in the body of your post, but use a attractive image that conveys the story you're trying to tell. Don't just put words in a graphic. That is not going to get you the level of engagement on social media that you want. And it's also not really telling a story. It's just sort of bombarding people with facts. But you're better off having an image that is going to really appeal to people and get them curious than to just kind of put that up there. Because if you look at some libraries' Instagram feeds, it's all graphics with text and it's just all competing, right? It's not capturing anyone's attention because they're like, all I see is a bunch of boxes with words on them. That's my little soapbox. I love Canva, but again, you got to be sparing with those graphics that have too many words in them. Then, of course, the strategies and tactics that I showed you earlier, these are how you're going to reach your objectives. So if you remember that big picture structure slide I showed you earlier, you've got your goal, you've got your measurable objectives, then you have your strategies and tactics. And that's how the rubber meets the road and you're getting the message out there. So some examples of strategies might be partnering with a community-facing organization on an event, pitching stories to the local media, something I need to do later today for one of my clients. Reach new customers with a direct mail campaign. So these are three very concrete examples of strategies you could use for a marketing communications plan. You may have already done these. Well, what are the tactics? Those are the specific elements of the story, of the strategies. So an example of a tactic would be scheduling meetings with potential partners or writing and distributing the news release. Or getting pricing on what it would cost to send a direct mail piece, because maybe you need to find that out before you know if you have the budget to do it. So those are your strategies and tactics. And again, a way that you can organize them is this thing called the PESO method, which stands for paid, earned, social, and owned. And so here's kind of the explanation of what these different things are. You have paid, which of course is anything you pay for, including advertising. But in libraries, I like to also include things like flyers and newsletters here, because libraries have a finite marketing budget. So you have a bucket of money and you're using it. And in many cases, libraries are still using most of that bucket for printed materials. I encourage libraries to think of it as part of that paid bucket, because if you were to stop, for example, printing an expensive newsletter, you could use that money for paid advertising. It's interchangeable in that paid bucket. So you want to put it there. Then you have earned, which again would be things like if you pitch a story to the media and they cover it and they run a story on your local TV station or your local newspaper. Although earned, I also would include things like partnerships. So let's say you're partnering with a local nonprofit and they include an article about the partnership in their newsletter, and thus it's reaching new and different audiences, that I would consider to be earned as well. Social would include anything, of course, on social media, but I also include in that bucket things like online reviews. When was the last time you looked at Yelp or Google Business or Facebook reviews to see how people are reviewing your library? That's an important piece too, because that is a illustration of your relationship with your audiences. And if there are negative reviews out there, it's important to show that the library is attentive and responding to those, even if you think they're unfounded, because other people see those and that tells them something about the library's relationship with its audiences. And then finally, owned. And these owned assets are extremely valuable. A spot on your homepage is a very, very valuable piece of real estate, right? A lot of people go to your homepage. So that's one example of an owned asset. And again, an asset that you have to use sparingly, because I did have one client once that had 19 sliders on their homepage, and that is too many. You're distracting your audiences at that point and competing with yourself. So homepage is an owned thing. Your email list, if you do email marketing or have an email newsletter, that's an owned asset. But also your buildings, right? Where you put out your flyers or your posters, those are owned assets. How are you allocating those? Are you having a lot of flyers from outside organizations? Do you have space for your own stuff? And again, making sure you're not competing with yourself too much there. So that's Peso. And that again, so if you use Peso to create your plan, then you can easily go through and kind of do an audit again of what you're already doing in these 4 categories. And you could probably list 20 things just off the top of your head. Then you can go through and say, okay, well, what are the opportunities and gaps? Like, what am I not doing that I'd like to be doing? And my last bullet over here, is there anything you'd like to stop doing that would allow you more capacity for the things you do want to do? So for example, at my former library, we discontinued doing a printed annual report because nobody was reading it and it was very time consuming and costly to have design and all that. And so we decided to use that capacity on other things like creating more social media content, writing stories of impact up, doing media pitches. So that's just an example. Or even if there's a paid thing that you want to stop paying for so that you can pay for something else, that would be another thing that you might want to evaluate in this process. And then, of course, demonstrating success with your implementation and evaluation, very important. So again, you've got your measurements that you chose for your measurable objectives. And again, you've got those measures that are part of planning and evaluation, as I talked about before. We've got our beautiful pyramid, as we mentioned earlier. So just referencing back to that on some of the things you can measure. And then here are just some very specific examples. And I'm not going to read through all of these because they're all on the pyramid. But what I've kind of done is taken a measure from the pyramid here on the left and then given you some specific examples here on the right that fall within library world, right? This isn't everything that we do, but it is certainly, giving you an example that you could use and pick from when you're creating your measurable objectives. Similarly, and I'm sorry, this is also where I organize them by leading and lagging indicators. So again, the things on this slide are things you can monitor throughout your campaign before you get to the end to see how things are going. Are email open rates trending up or down? Are we getting news stories out there about the thing that we're communicating about, right? Then we get to our lagging indicators. And again, here are just some examples. You may do a survey after the event or just to gauge general awareness. You may do a survey to understand whether people agree with certain things about your library that are important to you. At my library, it was the library is the top institution in the community. That was a statement that we would run in an annual county survey every year, and we could see, was it going up or going down? Happily, it went up by 10% in 3 years, and we were really pleased by that. That was a lagging indicator because it told us what had happened in the past, but it was still helpful for evaluation. Number of people who behaved as desired, and of course, repeating behavior, right? All good stuff. Sample survey statements. So if you need some examples that of, statements that you could put in a survey and have people agree, I really like these rating scale types of questions. They're very helpful for, again, just sort of gauging where people are in a continuum, and you can track whether that is trending up or down if you do these kinds of surveys on a regular basis. And then here are some other metrics. So one of my sample measurable objectives was about social media. Well, this is an example of a library measuring social media reach year over year. And if they look at this monthly, again, it can tell them like how things are trending. Like, oh, in February, we were falling behind where we were last year. But in June, we had almost doubled what we did last year. And the reason I like doing month over month, year over year, is that libraries follow seasons, right? We have busy seasons like summer reading. And so it's better to compare apples to apples by comparing this month, this year to this month, last year. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to compare this month to last month, because there's always going to be up and down months in libraries. Because again, we're very seasonal. We're very busy in the summer when kids are out of school, if we're public libraries. If you're an academic library, it's probably the inverse of this, right? Because it's when the kids are on campus that you're probably at your busiest. All right, let's see. Okay, here's an email marketing metric. Now, here's an example where I actually look at total monthly email views, not the percentage, because the percentage, it would be like your open rate. And if that's all you have, great. But the thing with open rate is it can be misleading. You could have an email list with 10 people on it, and 8 people open it. Well, that's an 80% open rate. Let's have a party. Oh, wait, only 8 people saw it, right? So I like to look at the totals, because that tells you not only how many people are opening it, but whether you're successfully growing your audience and growing the number of people within your audience who are actually opening it, right? So that's a little bit, tells more of a story to me of your successful marketing. And again, month over month, year over year is how I recommend looking at that. If you're a library that tracks monthly user count, monthly active user, usually libraries will look at a 3-year period. Anyone who's used their library account in the last 3 years is an active user. So looking at those counts, again, that just gives you a trend line, so you can see month over month how you're doing. Even though that's a snapshot in time, this is a little bit more of a lagging indicator, but it still kind of tells you, are things trending up or down? And up is always better, right? So if you're creating a plan, as we begin to wrap up, let's talk big picture about your planning efforts. If you're creating a plan for a special project, event, or other initiative, here are kind of the steps you want to go to. You want to first of all, ask yourself and your leadership, right? The people who have the most stake in this being successful. What does success look like? I once had a disagreement with a boss of mine where I was like, I swear you told me 15 people would be success coming to this event, and we had 40 people come. And he's like, no, I wanted 75. And I was like, no. So you want to know in advance, and hopefully everybody will remember, write it down so there won't be confusion. What does success look like? Using the principles we just covered, you can, but in the case of a specific event or project, you can have a more targeted approach. So instead of maybe aligning your goals with your strategic plan, if you were just doing a overarching plan for your library, you might just align your goals with what success looks like for that specific project, event, or initiative. So you're going to align it that way. You're going to create messaging about the project that's designed to resonate with your audiences. And in this case, maybe your audience is a little more targeted than that broad list of library audiences. Again, identify the best strategies and tactics to reach them. Check your leading indicators to make sure people are seeing, reading, and acting on your messages. Adjust as needed. And then at the end, use evaluation to see what worked well, and use that information for your next project. Here's a template and a bit.ly link where you can download that template if you want. Otherwise, you can just kind of freelance. And so obviously we can't do live Q&A here because this is a recorded webinar, but if you have any questions, here is my contact information. These slides are also going to be available through WVLS, so you can get a PDF of them if that would be helpful, or you can just, obviously copy it down from looking here. But thank you very much.